is about a man named Jean-Henri Dunant. I hope my French teacher from grade 7 liked that. That was the best I could do. He is the man that founded the Geneva Convention and the Red Cross. He was a strong, committed Christian. Doesn't mean he was perfect. And you look at his whole life, and he had some problems. But there's no doubt that Christianity was the driving force behind him and others who founded the Geneva Convention and the Red Cross. So it all started when Dunant, as a businessman, was on his way to try to see the French Emperor Napoleon III. Napoleon III, however, was on the battlefield at the time. Austria had taken some land in northern Italy, and the French and the Italians were trying to push the Austrians out. And so Dunant was on his way, and while he was there, the bloody Battle of Solferino took place. And on that day, June 25th, 1859, 40,000, an estimated 40,000 soldiers in one day were killed or wounded and lying on the battlefield. Now, in that time period, the 19th century, a wound was almost a death sentence. Armies hadn't figured out yet how to transfer wounded soldiers in any efficient way from the front lines to the rear of the operations. And the warring parties just thought physicians and nurses were combatants, and anyone who tried to, help anybody or bandage or care for the wounded just were fair targets. In fact, no one would help a wounded enemy. I mean, imagine you're coming to help a wounded enemy. There's a bloody soldier lying on the battlefield. Well, it could be a trick. They could just as likely rise up and stab you or shoot you. The end result of all this was just people bleeding to death, dying of dehydration, or infections taking over quickly that could set in before medical personnel could actually do much good. And for Dunant, this was just more than he could handle. And I mean, I probably would have run away in horror myself, but Dunant was a visionary genius. Again, he wasn't perfect. He was not a good student in school. He did very poorly in school, but he had some skills. He saw the opportunity now to use his organizational skills to maximize the effectiveness of what might be limited resources to deal with this situation. So in very short time period, he had the neighboring townspeople organized. He had the wounded moved into people's homes and chapels, even castles, and he begged resources from the nobles in the area. And most remarkably, he persuaded people to care equally for the wounded enemy. Does that bring to mind the teaching of anybody? Yeah, Jesus, the only person in history that I can think of that told us to love our enemies. So Dunant's catchphrase, his meme, was all our brothers, all our brothers. He kept telling the local volunteers. That was his meme. And it was a concrete demonstration of a Christian vision. Now, by October of 1863, Dunant had gathered in Geneva 31 delegates from 16 different nations to discuss his vision, which was to change what's happening in war and on battlefields. Now, there were other people trying to do it at this time. There were strong pacifists who were just doing everything they could to stop war, which one can understand. Dunant's version was a little bit more of an intermediary step. Given that we're going to have war, how can we deal with it? And of course, most people understand the Geneva Convention are basically like the rules of civil warfare today that the majority of our world has signed on to. And it was his vision that got this started. But he really wanted to put in place something for dealing with the type of scene that was at Solferino. And he wrote a book, which is what led to this convention, A Memory of Solferino was this book title. You can get for free on the Red Cross website these days. And the core of his idea was the term neutrality. Neutrality. If medical personnel could be considered neutral parties by both sides, then the wounded could be treated and many lives could be saved. But it was a very controversial idea for some of the reasons that I mentioned earlier, but Dunant won the day. Now, they had to have a way to identify these neutral parties. And one of the other key members, Louis Appia, came up with an idea of using the cross as a symbol, a red cross on a white background, which was the reverse of the Swiss flag. And so that's what was chosen. The symbol could be painted on ambulances, put on the battlefield. Medical workers could wear it on their armbands. I think that's where most of us are used to seeing it. And so, as a result of an August 1864 conference, I mean, these things take time, 12 nations signed the 10 articles that formed the first Geneva Convention, and the document guaranteed neutrality for ambulances, hospitals, medical workers, and their equipment. Also, for local inhabitants who helped the wounded, they were considered neutral. For wounded enemy soldiers, it also required the captors to treat the wounds of the enemies and to arrange for this to be done. So it actually spelled out obligations for armies, which is quite remarkable. I mean, I can just see some general saying, screw you. I don't care what you say. But Dunant managed to pull this off, along with 4 other key Christian members of this group. So it spelled out obligations for armies to search for, collect the wounded, and establish the Red Cross on a white background as this international symbol of protection and neutral assistance in times of war. And so by the end of 1867, 21 nations had signed the convention. Jean-Henri Dunant's story goes on afterwards. As a businessman, he was pretty good, I guess, but he ran into problems and he went bankrupt and his creditors weren't happy. And long story short, he ended up being destitute. So he's far from a perfect man. He lived most of his years in obscurity until 1901. He was sort of rediscovered, and the world's very first Nobel Peace Prize was given to him. It was shared along with another man who was, I believe, who was more of a pacifist. So this is a story of a Christian man who's actually doing what the teachings of Jesus say, using the skills that he has. And it's a specific example of accomplishing what he intended to accomplish. And not all of the examples of positive Christian impact are the intended results. A lot of them were not intended by the people involved.